Okay, that takes us to 2 minutes past 2 UK time. And I think it probably would be, I can see there's still a lot of people joining us. We now are up to around 51 people online from all, I can see from the names of people that I know, there are people from all over the world joining us. So it's great to have you with us. And on behalf of Energy for Impact and MECS, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar. The theme of today's webinar is Innovation and Growth, Current Trends in the Modern Energy Cooking Funding Landscape. The way that we're going to organise this session, we will have a short presentation by MECS and E4I on the key findings of a recent report that you may have seen on the MECS website, Modern Energy Cooking, a review of the funding landscape. And we then have a really excellent panel of colleagues to discuss the implications of the report and to think what the implications are in terms of where we're going in relation to trends in modern energy cooking, and in particular the financing of modern energy cooking. I want to start though just by saying a few words of thanks before I hand over to Malcolm, who's going to do the main presentation. Firstly, an awful lot of different organisations have helped in the development of this report, in answering the 2 surveys, and where there's been an enormous amount of feedback going into the lessons that we've been able to learn. So thank you to all of those organisations. In particular, I'd like to pick out ATEC, Burn, Circle Gas, ECS and Cocoa Networks, who allowed us to profile their commercial activities, which gave us a lot of insights that we were able to relay within the report. Secondly, to also thank Acumen, the Clean Cooking Alliance and the Shell Foundation, in particular for allowing us to profile their funding and advisory activities as good exemplars of interventions within the sector. And then finally, also thank you to Donee and her colleagues and also SE for All, who also spent a lot of time peer reviewing the document and also allowed us to use some of their excellent data on fund flows, particularly in the case of SE for All. The other thing to say is that if you weren't aware, this is the 5th in a series of 5 reports that we've done collaboratively with E4I. All of them are available on the MECS website, and the other reports cover issues like appliance funding, crowdfunding, the particular context of humanitarian settings and RBF programs. The landscape report draws on those other reports for the sake of completeness, but is the attempt to try and bring our learning from all of this together. So just before I hand over to Malcolm, which I'll do in a moment, I want to introduce Donee Alexander to you. You can see on the screen at the moment, who is the Chief Science and Learning Officer at the Clean Cooking Alliance, and we will hand over to Donee to moderate the discussion. Donee's done this on a number of occasions with us now, and we're always delighted to have her with us. Also, if colleagues are here and are able to turn on their cameras, it would be good to introduce the speakers on the panel. So we have Ash Sharma, who's the Vice President of Nefco and the head of the Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa. So welcome, Ash. We also have Ben Jeffries, who is the CEO of ATEC, who joins us actually from Australia this morning. Therefore, is actually he's looking very small on my particular screen here, but I don't know if you can see him. He's probably looking quite tired given the time difference there. Tim Cowman, who's the head of the Nairobi Office of Climate Care, also joins us. Kate Montgomery, the head of business relationships and government partnerships at Acumen. And finally, also Irene Wanjohi, who is the Senior Customs Relations and Marketing Officer at Kenya Power. We thank all of you for joining us, and we're sure we're going to have a really exciting discussion once we've been through the main findings of the report. So at this stage, really all that it remains me to do is to thank you all for joining us. I'm really looking forward to seeing the discussion that we will have and hearing from Malcolm and Peter in terms of their description of the report itself. So Malcolm, over to you. Malcolm, I think you're still muted if you're trying to speak.
Okay, is that better now, Ed? Yeah.
Yes, that's perfect.
Everyone can hear me. Great, fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Ed. And yes, it's a great pleasure to be able to present our report to such a distinguished audience. I think it's clear that it is quite a comprehensive and wide-ranging report. It really initiated from some survey work that was done by E4I around both the company survey and the funders survey, but we wanted to make the report more informative. So we've added in quite a lot on different sources of funding, different transactions that have been done, the profiles that Ed already alluded to, and essentially we wanted to have a more detailed report that would be of interest to a sort of larger audience. So both people who know the sector very well and some people who are perhaps more interested to get to know really what's going on at the present time. And the other thing is because things are changing so quickly in the sector, we wanted to try and take a more forward-looking perspective so that people reading it could get an idea of the direction and the opportunities going forward. So if I move on to the next slide, which I need to do, I'm not quite sure why it doesn't go forward. Oh, here we are. Thank you. So I think a starting point is to say that the sector is changing very rapidly indeed. Not very long ago, the kind of clean cooking solutions that were available to poorer populations really centered around relatively simple, lower tier, improved cook stoves. Obviously, some places there are better quality opportunities, but for a large part of the populations, this is really the kind of solutions that are available. And therefore, essentially that the sector was seen really as being low technology, relatively unprofitable, for quite small scale operators, localized, and really relatively unscalable and unattractive for investment to a large number of people. Therefore, it's been a subsidized sector with a lot of sort of NGO type activity. So now we see that the sector is changing dramatically. And one of the main reasons for that is that modern energy cooking is becoming increasingly viable. And this is a product of more efficient appliances, more energy efficient appliances, and basically cheaper costs. So whereas even 2 or 3 years ago, for example, electric cooking was being seen as being completely non-competitive for poorer populations, this is no longer the case. MECS has been doing quite a lot of work on the electrical side. This report, Cooking with Electricity, that was done jointly with ESMAP, has gone into this area in considerable detail and come up with a pretty compelling case actually for electric cooking. And similarly, the sort of behavioral type work that's been done with the e-cookbooks showing how in practice this can work has, I think, also been very given a very strong case for it. And so it's not just that the devices, the appliances are giving good energy results, but they're also giving good user experiences. And at the same time that the appliance costs and the energy costs of using them are coming down, the charcoal prices are if anything, increasing. Therefore, the modern energy cooking is becoming increasingly competitive, and not, of course, just with electricity, with other fuel types, technology types, LPG, ethanol, biogas, and the biomass gasifiers as well. So with these new solutions, you obviously get the challenge of higher appliance costs. And of course, for poorer populations, these are a significant factor. And this, of course, comes in from the perspective of consumer financing to enable consumers to purchase, and also from the issue of the company financing in the case that they have to either manage the receivables themselves or put that over to some third-party financing organization to handle the financing side of that. However, at the same time, it does also open up different kinds of funding alternatives. And these were some of the ones that we looked at in the report. And some of these are relatively new, such as, for example, the Onbill financing, hence the question mark. But although, for example, the traditional kind of cash and carry approach and layaway savings towards purchase were found to be very important, there's no question that the opportunity to pay over a period of time, and especially to achieve cost savings on fuel acquisitions or charcoal acquisitions, for example, during that period, can be a very powerful way to promote the purchase of these appliances. So when we looked at the survey work and some of the discussions we had around that, it became clear that there were a number of fairly clear priorities that companies had. So one, I think, was that, for example, grants, technical assistant grants, particularly for innovation, but also for corporate development and to support fundraising efforts, were a very high priority for companies and for the sector. And it's very clear that the companies that we profiled and other companies which are emerging and extremely important for not only for their own ability to grow and perform a service, but for the demonstration effect that they have to other parties, that in almost all of the cases, these innovation grants have played a really crucial role. And therefore, I think there is a very powerful justification and a need to go on supporting that area. Other priorities that we identified were the need for patient equity. Patient in the sense of both expectation of lower returns and expectation of being able to remain as an investor without a need for a quick and rapid exit. And I think in this sector, which is relatively low, has been relatively unprofitable in the past, I think this need for patient equity is extremely important. And there is a challenge in doing that, to be honest. I think there aren't as many investors. It's very difficult, in fact, to make relatively small scale investments in areas which are relatively unprofitable and to stay with those investments for quite a long period of time. And therefore, it is a challenge to a number of organizations, of course, who may have a mandate which requires a slightly more market-based return. And the other area that we see as being very important is that of receivables funding, because as companies grow rapidly, then the opportunity to increase their sales increases, but then the issue of how you fund those receivables, given that, as we say, the appliances may require payment over an extended period, it can become a constraint. And what's interesting is that we mentioned in the report there are some interesting kind of innovative solutions coming in from into clean cooking, which we hope could be extended in future, because we think they can be very interesting, and maybe some of the panelists would have a chance to comment on these also later on. So I think one of the other big issues that we see arising is the use of digital technology, and this has become, I think, very important going forward for the whole of the funding landscape, because we see digital technology really being used in almost every single fuel type. So in electric, obviously, in LPG, ethanol, biogas, and in the more later generation gasifiers. And so we have more sophisticated companies who are being able to use these technologies towards financing solutions. And also we have companies, A2EI is a case in point, as we've sort of highlighted here, who can interpret the information that's coming through the system. So both for company commercial purposes, but also for potential use in the area of funding, in reporting going forward. So this is undoubtedly a very important development in the landscape, and we have a number of examples to illustrate why we think this is the case. So obviously, with this digital technology, it enables pay-go, i.e. payment over time through mobile telephony for example, smart metering. And this is a very, this is where, of course, it's been proved and tested in the solar home system market, and it increasingly is coming into these modern energy cooking appliances, which is going to be very helpful going forward. Another area where I think digital technology is starting to play a big role and has another big role going forward is in the carbon credits. So carbon credits are now widely recognized as having a very important role to play in the financing of clean cooking. So historically, as we all know, it's been a very problematic market in the sense that there's been a great deal of price volatility, and there have been some issues in terms of controversy. However, there's no question that the carbon credit market is extremely important, and it's proving its value in many respects. So a common misunderstanding is that poorer populations don't use a lot or don't experience a lot of carbon emissions in their cooking. Well, this is not the case. So typical households maybe on an open fire might be, for example, using say five tons of CO2 emissions per annum, and the opportunity to save heavily on this by using cleaner cooking is widely recognised. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of background noise there. So with the higher levels of emission reduction prices or carbon credit prices, which are currently, I believe, in the range of about $6 to $9 per ton, it obviously represents a fantastic opportunity to increase the earnings to clean cooking companies or project developers, and at the same time to lower appliance costs, which in turn can enable poorer populations to access these technologies. And I think this is a very exciting development in the sector. So the point about the digital technology is that there are new approaches to measuring and certifying emission reductions based on actual fuel usages, by basically noting the efficiency of the appliances, the extent to which they're used, and basically deriving the emission savings directly from the fuel usage. So we were very happy to be involved with Climate Care in the work that they were doing with Gold Standard to introduce this new methodology. And Gold Standard, of course, is doing a lot of work on moving things onto a digital platform. And this is, I think, really good news for the sector going forward. There's obviously more work that needs to be done, but it is a very interesting, exciting development. So similarly, the issue of attracting funding for other SDG type impacts, of course, it's very well known how important these other impacts can be in the case of introducing clean cooking. A huge amount of attention rightly is going to the health issue because of the debilitating effects of exposure to emissions and to smoke and particulate matter. We mentioned climate already, climate in the sense of both CO2e and obviously black carbon. Very strong gender impacts, which are very well known, related sort of livelihood improvements and other sort of environmental factors, deforestation. So very strong positive SDG impacts from clean cooking. And the question, well, how do you then attract funding to pay for that? So the one way is to go through carbon credits and to commercialize a lot of this through the quantification of co-benefit impacts, and that's a very important area. Another one, of course, is to see how this work can be done through, for example, other grant type programs, RBF type programs. And the issue of digitalization is that similarly, there are similar opportunities to fast track, simplify, reduce the cost of quantifying these impacts, demonstrating these impacts, and reporting on them. But again, more work is being done on this and needs to be done, but there are very strong opportunities out there. So I think the significance, I think, of the move to modern energy cooking with these different fuel types and the increasingly viability of these new appliances and these new fuel types, together with the digital technology involved, is that we are seeing a transformation in the clean cooking landscape. So we have more sophisticated appliance companies, and we have some major international appliance companies who are starting to look at these more frontier markets. We have, for example, solar home system companies who are actively looking to see how they can integrate clean cooking products into their product offerings. We have many good groups who are piloting and trialing clean cooking. Utilities increasingly looking to become involved. NGOs historically have always been there. Distributors and financing groups obviously becoming more involved because of the requirements of these the greater funding requirements related to the appliances, as we mentioned already. And then behind this, we have some large energy groups who may be looking at the market in a different way, basically saying, okay, well, if clean cooking is going to be using LPG or it's going to be using ethanol, are there opportunities for us to promote our business through promoting clean cooking? And then in addition to all of that, of course, there is the whole role of government involved. So I think the sense of this is to just simply make a very broad and basic comment that clean cooking now involves a very wide range of institutions, which opens up a lot of different alternatives and institutions who are looking at the market in completely different ways. And one of the points that we feel very strongly, and we think is extremely important, is that as these wider opportunities open up, then the opportunity to introduce these extremely important developmental finance organizations is now very, very much more realistic. So you compare the old days where we had these rather small, unsophisticated, relatively unprofitable groups producing improved cook stoves in the market. We have a completely different landscape now. And therefore, there really are opportunities for multilateral development banks and development finance institutions to start engaging in a much bigger way. This is starting to happen, which is great news, but we can certainly do a lot more in that direction. Absolutely no question about that. And it isn't just a question of persuasion. It's also a question of helping these organizations to come involved. So not just advocacy, but also actively, proactively doing some necessary support work by people like ourselves and the Alliance and SE for All to really help these institutions engage. So an example of how the universe is expanding and new opportunities arising would, and a very important one, I think, would come from utility-led financing. So as utilities become involved, so a very interesting opportunity arises for example, Onbill financing with all of the important advantages that has in terms of knowing the clients, being able to build in an easy way and amortize costs and all of these kind of simplifying repayments through the utility bills. And also another alternative being the sort of data enabled lending through as an alternative to direct involvement. And again, we have fortunate enough to have a lady from KPLC on the panel who we hope will talk around that a little bit and in a much more authoritative way than I have. So another perspective which we think is extremely important, and again is arising from this different kind of clean cooking universe which is coming in, is the opportunity to leverage the large scale energy investments. So a point commonly often made is that if we look at clean cooking as a separate sector, the amounts of funding in clean cooking are really quite small, whereas the amounts of funding in energy as such are enormous. And the graphs I have here is simply electricity compared to clean cooking for this universe of high impact countries which we took from SE for All. But the larger point is the new thrust to integrate clean cooking into the broader energy agendas. And this is an extremely important issue, and one that we didn't think we did justice to in this present report. So we are intending to produce another report that just looks at this whole area and the different aspects of it, because it is hugely important to the way we go forward in promoting clean cooking. So I think with that, I would just simply like to wrap it up, and maybe just to highlight again a few key takeaways. So the point about digital technology opening up a large number of very new important financing opportunities. We mentioned PAYGO, Onbill financing, for example, the carbon credits, the impact funding, and integrating it into other forms of RBF and grant funding. This is, for us, this is a very important development, and one which is going to become more apparent going forward, and one we need to devote more efforts to making work. As we mentioned, we feel the new change landscape creates new opportunities to attract capital into the sector, and it should promote the greater involvement of multilateral development banks. We've highlighted the issue of donor grants for innovation, corporate development, and advice. These have been extremely important, and we definitely feel that these need to be continued going forward. Also, patient equity and receivables funding, and then the final point about the need to integrate cooking into the broader energy agendas. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for listening and your attention, and pass the floor over to my good friend and colleague, Peter Weston of Energy for Impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. So I'm just going to say a few additional words, kind of building on Malcolm's presentation, to give maybe a sense of perspective. I think it's fair to say we've looked at all aspects of clean cooking financing, appliance financing, utility-led financing, carbon credits, RBFs, equity financing, and the like. But it's clear from our perspective that carbon credits is really the key area. Just to give you a sense, if you compare RBF to carbon credits, so an RBF grant would maybe cover 50% of the costs of a stove. That's probably equivalent to maybe 10% of the lifetime cost of an electric pressure cooker. So it's a relatively small part of the lifetime cost. Carbon credits, in contrast, you can expect to get multiple values from the cost of the stove, maybe 5 times the value of the stove you can get in carbon credits. Of course, it's going to depend on the technology, it's going to depend on the market, but I just wanted to highlight that as a very important point. And when we look at the energy access market, probably the most interesting market for carbon credits is clean cooking. So that's one point I wanted to make. Another thing I wanted to say was about the survey work we did. It was done back in 2020, so it's a little bit old, but I think that the results of that survey probably still apply today, and it will be interesting to see what the panel think. We spoke to about 68 different companies and stakeholders, and we asked them what's the biggest barriers to scale. And the companies were saying 75% of them said affordability was the key thing, and half of them talked about access to finance and lack of viable business models. The funders, in contrast, 80% of them said it was a lack of a viable business model, which was the key challenge for them. And the second biggest challenge for them was a lack of investable pipeline. And one of the things is, talking to with the funders on the panel, is how do they look at clean cooking? Do they look at clean cooking as a single market? Do they look at it as 5 markets, ethanol, LPG, biogas, electric, ICS? I think that's something that's quite important. The third thing I just wanted to comment on is the growing importance of crowdfunding. It's something that we talk about quite a lot, and that Energy for Impact does a lot of work in. For the period up to 2020, a relatively small amount of funding for the sector came from crowdfunding. It was about $8 million compared to roughly 153 million from 2017 to 2019, which was mainly on the equity side. But we think it's going to grow. We say this for a number of reasons. There are donors out there like RVO who are looking to promote clean cooking, and we really welcome that initiative. And we also know crowdfunding platforms who aren't maybe currently in the clean cooking sector, who are looking to get into it, perhaps doing lending on the back of, secured on the back of hard currency carbon credits. So I think that's an interesting trend that we should watch out for. Final point to say is, we're well aware financing is very challenging, but it's just one part of the challenge for growing clean cooking. Is the market mature enough? We've talked about affordability of the stoves and the fuels, consumer awareness, user friendliness and aspirational nature of the stove, supply chains, policy. All of these things need to be considered. And perhaps when the panel speaks later, it would be interesting to get a sense of what they see today as still being the biggest challenges for them to invest more in the space. Thank you very much. Over to you, Donee.
Great, thanks, Peter. And I have two screens open here so I can look at chat as well. So excuse me, but I want to start off by saying I had the pleasure of reading this report before moderating it. And when I look at the value out of a report, is it relevant now? Is it easy to read? And did I learn something? And I think all of those things with this report were very strong. It's a perfect report for the times in which we currently find ourselves within the clean cooking space. We, as is very clearly highlighted by Malcolm and Ed earlier, the sector has changed dramatically over the last couple of years. And with that, we need to be looking at how do we keep up from a financing perspective, and what do we do to really see exponential scale, which is needed for us to get to 2030. So I found this to be a very useful and important piece to add to really the space right now. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say today on some of the things that were highlighted in the report. I'm going to start it off with Kate, actually, today, Kate Montgomery from Acumen, because Malcolm talked about patient equity and the importance of that. And Acumen has been a leader in patient equity investment, both as an investor and as an enabler. But it still seems like it is a challenge for a lot of clean cooking companies. Kate, do you see any ways that we can improve the situation? And what are you doing from Acumen's side?
Donee, and really appreciate being here and the work we've done to date with MECS. And great job in the report, Malcolm. We're really excited it was wonderful to read it and see what depth you've learned about the sector. Yeah, so Acumen's been investing in the space for over 10 years. We have done, we kind of started doing this work, at least in the cooking space, about 5, 6, 7 years ago. And even then, have taken some interesting bets, some which have paid off and others that have struggled a bit more. And we would say that, the days of optimistic equity where proven business models have, they're not evidenced is really on the way out. So, this idea that kind of, maybe in a few years this will actually pan out is not really the case anymore. And I think a lot of people on the energy, on the biomass cooking side have really been burned. And I think, the companies that we have seen that have found success, which is really only one or two, at least in our experience, really has been kind of expansion into modern cooking services. So LPG, carbon, pay-as-you-go, electric, really kind of, expanding, experimenting with business models, and going beyond just kind of a traditional biomass distribution play. And so equity is, is as competitive as it ever has been, and it's really going where there's a story of growth, a pathway to profitability, and exits. And we haven't, again, in the traditional biomass space, we really haven't seen any exits to speak of. And for us, we've seen our first actually last year, which was really exciting, but again in the LPG space. And so it really became again kind of a proof point for the promise and the opportunity around modern cooking, which is exciting. And I think so, again, where it's a pure distribution play for biomass stoves, it's really hard to compete. And, they don't have the money the customers are not there and margins are too small. So, and so what we're seeing too is, it's been really rare, those successful companies. And what that means is for the next generation of companies, replicating that model is even going to be harder, right? So I think what we're going to see is other, new players coming in, and this is what Malcolm talked about, mini grid, solar home system companies are really coming in. They're able to already provide pay-as-you-go. And so cooking really becomes more of an appliance add-on, and there's definitely some opportunity there. Again, carbon prices, like were mentioned, really interesting because both that allows for subsidized pricing to the end consumer and really making margins more realistic for the business as well. And I think, again, kind of the financial innovation that we're seeing in the market is also another place where some of the barriers or the challenges that companies have found, including kind of appetite from customers, price points, affordability, if carbon credits are coming in to kind of alleviate some of those pressures and really bring down the price point, again, we're seeing kind of potential some new opportunities and companies that could really scale. So I'll stop there, but I think a lot, just to kind of highlight a lot of the trends that were mentioned in the report is what we're seeing on the ground as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with you. And it's really good to hear that at least Acumen has seen a couple of winners, and that we're seeing that, because 10 years ago, that wasn't the case in our space. I do want to say before I move to Ben from ATEC that if any of the participants on this panel have questions, just put them in the chat. And we'll try to get to those at the end, or if not, we'll answer those online. So feel free if something comes up for one of the panelists or for Ed or Malcolm or myself, just put them in the chat. So yeah, next I want to move on to Ben Jeffries from ATEC. And the landscape report really highlights how digital technology can be used to reduce the costs of accessing carbon credits for companies. So what do you see as the opportunities for ATEC digital technologies? And do you think it's feasible to use carbon credits to make modern energy cooking affordable for bottom of the pyramid communities? And I do want to focus on that bottom of the pyramid communities, because as we start to transition to these higher cost technologies, I think that's an area where we need to be really thoughtful, is how do we still reach the bottom of the pyramid? So Ben, I'd love to hear from you on this.
Yeah, thanks, Donee, and yeah, thanks for MECS for putting this on today, and happy to be a part of it. On the question you raise, I think what it goes back to, and it links a bit back to the last point as well, is around trust. And I think what data can bring, particularly to the carbon credit market and clean cooking, is the ability, well, it kind of brings two things, but I think probably the biggest one is verification that the devices are actually in use. I think this has been particularly quite a significant problem in biomass cook stoves historically. And I do know of a couple of projects that were carbon credit backed projects in Asia that had significant issues with this, where there was big promises made around use that weren't actually seen through. And I think this is a pretty broad issue for if we're really to make sure that clean cooking is taken seriously. As a carbon credit generator, we need to be able to verify that people are actually using the technology. So that's where I think that's a big advantage of having that sort of digital and data connectivity to the device, is you can validate that directly off the usage data. The second part that I think it really adds to it is carbon credits are a fantastic opportunity, but are quite clunky from a cash flow perspective. You have a very big time lag between when the carbon credit is effectively generated, or the carbon offset is generated, through to when you actually receive the funds for that as an enterprise. And what that does is act as a major brake on scale as well. So the ability to be able to digitize that carbon credit process which is what we're now working on with ClimateCare. I know Tim's on the panel too, with some support from MECS around the new meter methodology, setting up through that. Our hope is the ability to be able to generate, issue and validate carbon credits on a fairly regular basis. The shorter the cash conversion cycle we can do from where the credit is generated to actually monetizing that credit, being able to much more automate that process, just means our ability to scale is going to be much faster. So I think, to summarize it up, I think sort of digital and data, what it brings is number one, around trust, I think, which is going to be critical for us to achieve scale. And then number two, around our cash cycles as well, which again will be a big driver for scale too.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. And you wouldn't believe that it's actually almost midnight there, or midnight, or I don't know exactly where you are in Australia, but that was very, very nice discussion there. And I do want to take it to Tim then, because I think you mentioned the new methodology, and I would love to hear a little bit more about that methodology. I think it's been a long time that we've needed it actually in the sector, because the things that you brought up, Ben, are exactly some of the issues that I think a lot of it have brought in distrust to what's actually happening in the carbon market for clean cooking. And so I want to hear a little bit more about this methodology and where you think it's going to take us going forward, because I think it is really important, Tim.
Yeah, thanks for the platform. There's a bit of a carbon credit theme running through the responses to date, which is quite exciting. And yeah, thanks for MECS as well for the opportunity. I'm actually going to, my colleague Tom, who's the lead author of the methodology, is on the call as well.
Oh, good.
Tom,
I didn't know Tom was on.
Yeah, he's also joined us ad hocly, I think. Tom, are you able to speak about the methodology?
Yes, I can. Very briefly, I don't want to be very technical on this, but traditionally what we've done is when it comes to carbon credits, we have tended to monitor the project from the point of view of doing surveys, and then assuming that the results of those surveys represent the actual situation and the total population. Now, what the MECS method does is it actually starts by looking at the actual energy consumption and then translates that into what would have been the consumption in the baseline without the MECS, the technology, and then works around that to determine the emission reduction of the project. This basically means that in principle, we can actually apply the methodology using real data that has been captured in real time without having to do all those surveys. So that's the gist of it.
Yeah, and I think it is really a nice step forward in our space, and I think will help bring in transparency. And so that's why I really like this methodology a lot. And I think going back to you, Tim, and just asking, what are the main challenges that developers are facing in accessing carbon credits, and how do companies like ClimateCare help to facilitate this?
Yeah, thanks. So, okay, I think historically one of the challenges has been the kind of depressed market scenario that we were operating in, and what Tom mentioned about kind of the lack of maturity or sophistication in the methodologies themselves actually reflected the maturity of the market as well, and the amount of finance that was flowing through the carbon finance funnel, let's say. So that situation has, for those of us who've been in the market for a long time, it's completely pivoted back to the days of kind of 2010, 2011, 2012, where we're seeing kind of long-term appetite for financing projects, not just cook-stove projects, but others. So that is, as a kind of broader backdrop, that now is allowing the market and allowing developers and actors in the market to think in quite a different way. So I think that challenge previously of accessing finance was more that this was a kind of results-based cherry on the top of the cake, kind of additional finance that may or not come at a certain level at a future date. And as Ben mentioned, maybe 18 months, 24 months down the line. And there was a bit of uncertainty around what that level of finance may be. So I think that challenge to a certain degree has been removed. I think there's quite a lot of money available in the market. There is one slight caveat that there's a lot of interest in removals projects, and there's been quite a shift in appetite towards removals because of net zero aspirations. But the kind of feeling within our company is there'll be a pivot back towards avoidance projects just because of the time that it takes to get removals projects moving and get a payback on that investment, be that environmentally or financially. So in terms of the challenge of accessing, I think there's money available. And now the challenge is really, as Ben was mentioning, is how sophisticated can the market move? And also what Malcolm was talking to, can we really turn carbon finance into kind of a working capital opportunity for businesses and have digitalized MRV, and then move towards more regular issuances, because the carbon prices and that is giving a business case that actually those issuance exercises on a more regular basis can then release upfront finance for these businesses. And I think that's where we currently are. And maybe just to conclude, of course, going through those immediate, the 100% necessary steps that we're going through with ATEC at the moment on ensuring that you select the correct standard, the correct methodology, and you go through all of the very rigorous steps that you need to go to ensure that you can actually generate the carbon credits in the end is kind of fundamental givens that Climate Care and other companies in the market can support businesses to access the finance with those technical fundamentals. And I think I'll pause there.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really helpful. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but a question did come up because you brought up the term removals. And I think that's a big heated topic right now. I do not want to devolve us too much, but I think for this audience, maybe a lot of people don't understand the difference between, what a clean cooking program is and a removal project. So could you just quickly define that for the audience?
Yeah, and again, I don't want to open up cans of worms technically here either, but
we don't have to discuss whether it's good or bad. Just
yeah, I mean, in short, it's the removals projects are, in very crude terms, planting a tree and growing that tree in order for it to remove carbon that was in the atmosphere, as opposed to, as Malcolm projected earlier, on the stove scenario where you have a current baseline which projects a certain amount of emissions are going to be emitted into the atmosphere, but by implementing your solution, you then avoid that emission, so you reduce the future emissions. There's a few discussions around those, but okay.
Yep. Thank you. I want to move on to Ash and Ash Sharma from Nefco. And first of all, congratulations. I haven't had a chance that you guys have launched the Modern Cooking Fund for Africa, which I think is great news for the sector. It's a major program. I think it's focusing on 6 or 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I would love to hear more about this. What are the major objectives? How can it address some of the financing challenges facing the program? Just a little bit of an overview, because it is really important for where we are right now in the clean cooking space. And so it's I think, just great to see it finally launched.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Testing some new headphones. Okay, well, thank you so much for this opportunity, and to the whole crowd at MECS, and congratulations on the report. I think it's it's a commendable piece of work. I think it highlights a lot of the financing issues. The whole series is definitely a very helpful. Okay, so the modern sort of cooking facility for Africa is really building on some of the work that we've done in the past with the Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa, which has been working on the other side of the SDG 7 coin on clean access to clean electricity. And this is really an attempt to try and raise the bar in terms of particularly biofuels. So the eligible products and technologies that we're working on are the biofuels, biogas, bioethanol, pellets. We also look at electric cooking as well. So yeah, the only exclusions really are traditional biomass. So we don't have improved cook stoves and LPG. So those are the main sort of exclusions. And of course, we also look at tier 3. So tier 4, 5, but tier 3 stoves, which are primarily briquettes, which meet certain performance standards. And the idea here really, again, like the Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa, is really that we're supporting companies, or clean cooking providers, primarily private organizations. They can include not-for-profits as part of the consortium, but they're primarily private sector enterprises. And we believe that they understand their markets the best. We believe that they are best placed to use the type of funding that we're offering, which is catalytic grants and results-based financing. So we're not prescriptive in our approach, and we also try to incentivize a number of the issues that have been raised. So stove use monitoring, for example. We're also keen to look at providing smart subsidies towards fuel sales and so forth. And we're very keen to support carbon finance. It's been a very topical discussion. We at Nefco have been working with carbon finance in cook stoves for over 10 years, but primarily with the clean cook stoves, the improved cooking stoves. So we do think that there's an opportunity here to try and sort of raise the bar a bit and move towards these higher tier solutions. So we're yeah, I'm unapologetic for that. I mean, there's only a certain part of the market that we can access and support, but we feel that this is a niche for the instrument going forwards.
That's great. And what countries is it operating in?
Right. Okay. So we're operating in DR Congo, in Kenya, in Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, and one other country which will be announced shortly.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry,
and
I put you on 10 minutes for that.
I love that there's a lot of flexibility within the fund, because I think that's needed right now. Given that there are a relatively small number of, successful and proven cooking business models, is this something that the fund will help or be a good, like an instrument to help with this issue? Or is it more, just if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be helpful, because I think that's where I'm a little bit unclear.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we recognize that, when we're trying to, of course, we want to work with PAYGO. We want to work with some of the carbon finance opportunities, and we recognize that many companies out there are unable to access this. Carbon finance is fantastic if you can access it, if you can upfront the capital for developing some of these projects. We see that for many smaller companies, that's going to be a real barrier. We know that there are companies like Climate Care and others who can support that. We do see there's a space there as well, but I think there's a number of these organizations which don't have that wherewithal, and we can provide that both in terms of grants and of course technical assistance. I think TA is quite key, particularly when you want to try and support some of these local companies. And I think as the report has sort of highlighted, some of the business plans are not compelling enough for a lot of the local investors. I mean, ideally, we'd like to have the situation where they can reach out to the local lenders and so forth, but we're clearly not there at all. You've seen from the low volume of finances going to clean cooking, particularly compared to electricity.
Yeah, it sounds like this might be a good instrument to bring the companies along until they are ready for some large scale investment, and I think that's really helpful. I'd love to move it on to Irene. I haven't seen if she is on yet, but Irene, are you on?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for joining. There's been a lot of discussion about on-bill finance by utilities, and I think that's a hot topic in the moment. How do you see the prospects for introducing this? And is this something that you think that Kenya Power and Lighting Company might consider in the future?
I think it's something that is, sorry, I think my camera is refusing to work, so you may not see me. I think it's something that is definitely that definitely can work in my country, in Kenya, and that can work in Kenya Power. We have been working with something we call Stima Loan that has helped over 1 million people get connected to the grid in Kenya. It's not the best product that we have because we keep disconnecting customers to get our money back in. But through this, we have learned that it is actually a product. It's a way that we can go in and get customers to get connected into clean cooking. We've been looking at it and thinking maybe through on-bill financing, we can start by giving customers maybe a starter kit, something like an EPC, an electric pressure cooker, or any other equipment, maybe a steam shower to go with as they get connected. So that we start then on billing, but it would have to go with a bit of IT, a lot of IT programs and other programs that we have to update in our systems before we do this. So it's definitely something that is being considered by the company.
Okay.
I don't know if I've answered you.
Yeah, that's great. I think another thing that has come up is linking cooking to the wider energy agenda. For example, leveraging large-scale investment being made in LPG or in electricity. As a leading utility company in Kenya, can you see ways in which this approach may work in practice?
Definitely. There are ways it can work. For example, just last year or is it the year before last, we were involved in distributing bulbs. We called it Badilisha bulb. We were distributing bulbs, and that's because that was in the wider energy agenda to distribute bulbs and to get rid of the older bulbs, the normal bulbs that everybody had. So if the clean cooking agenda got into the main agenda, energy agenda, then we can get like everybody to start getting a starter kit, as I said, like distributing, for example, those EPCs or induction cookers or other energy efficient appliances to customers, because then it would be in the agenda of the government. And if it becomes an agenda of the government, then first of all, it would be easy to distribute this to every customer that wants to get involved. And Kenya Power would get involved because we know where our customers are. So because we're already in that space, it would be very easy to roll like we did with the bulb. It's something that we have actually involved the ministry, those in the ministry we have talked about, to see how is it possible to involve the clean cooking agenda in the main agenda. And it's something that is we're talking. Yeah. It's in the small level. I hope it can get to the higher tables. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'd like to move it back to Ben, because one of the things that Malcolm talked about was the challenge of funding receivables and how it is problematic for fast-growing companies. So like ATEC. So do you think that there are some interesting solutions available or special purpose vehicles or similar structures? And can you talk a little bit about, the challenge and what might be available from ATEC's perspective?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, particularly if you're doing pay-go, such as we do across both electric cooking and biogas, then that debt financing is critical to underwrite that payment structure. So the good news from our side is obviously we have the PAYGO solar sector, which has been the trailblazer in the sector. So being able to leverage off that experience, investors are familiar with PAYGO, et cetera as well, and that has that advantage. It also brings a bit of baggage with it as well from the solar sector. And not everything's been absolutely rosy at the same time. So we just need to be able to navigate that. But I think there's a very strong value proposition around PAYGO in cooking. I think, for us, predominantly, we're doing mainly on balance sheet PAYGO debt investing to date. That seems to have worked well for us so far. We have had a look at looking at setting up, say, an SPV in order to move that forward. I think that definitely has some advantages, particularly around isolating the debt out both from the company and the investor side and the account receivables. I'm not an expert in the area, but I think probably the main challenge is there's quite a bit of complication, or there's a lot of additional admin is probably the better descriptor of moving down that path. So I think it is a good thing if you're the right company at the right size. I know at least Bbox, I think, has done it in solar. I don't know if there's been multiple others. I haven't looked into it, but yeah, there are options out there. I think one interesting area to look at in the future will be a combination of PAYGO and carbon credits. Both are basically trailing revenue streams that could be potentially combined together and be financed under one debt instrument as well. And again, that could be something under a SPV or whatever the case is, or on balance sheet as well. So I think it's an emerging area that I think potentially will get more interesting the better we get at these multiple revenue streams that we can leverage off modern cooking products.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be done still in that space. So we'll see where it goes in the next 5 years, and maybe that can be the one of the next set of reports by MECS to have an update on that. Moving on to Kate, Acumen has identified consumer finance and affordability as the major issues for uptake of modern energy cooking appliances. So do you see PAYGO as a game changer in this, as it kind of has been in the solar home system markets, or do you think that it's, there's more needed?
Thank you. Yeah, I absolutely think financing will be a massive part of the growth of the sector over the next 5 years, and it's likely to be led by pay-as-you-go. And this is because we know that cookstove company or customers have limited ability to pay. And so the financing enables them to move towards more high quality cook stoves and appliances. However, what we don't think is a future is that every cook stove company becomes a pay-as-you-go company. We really hope that, as we know, PAYGO comes with a crazy amount of complexity. It's hard to finance. It's capital intensive. So we really hope that that's not what cook stove companies have to all do. And a lot of PAYGO companies we know have not been able to do it. And so what we're hoping though is that, or we think PAYGO and clean cooking is going to work well when it's offered by a company that knows credit, that offers multiple products to a range of customers, and that's able to raise wholesale financing. So, this is really, we see, companies that are already have the PAYGO infrastructure, already have a group of customers, already have the financing that they need, can easily add cooking as an appliance. But every distributor becoming a cooking financier just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And something that, I think we're also hoping to see is, and we've seen this in the off-grid energy sector as well, is some kind of disintegration of the business model, right? So these pioneers that we're seeing that are really successful, they've had to do everything. And what we're hoping in the future, as this market or subsector matures, we're hoping to see kind of, specialized providers, people that are really focused on the manufacturing, people that are really focused on the distribution, people that are focused on the financing, so that the companies don't have to do everything. And lastly, for all crypto, particularly EPCs, the end customer price is still prohibitive. So again, how we figure out ways to bring down that price through, subsidy or, end user subsidy, I think is still really important. So, pay as you go can't solve that problem. wholly, right? You add financing to an already really expensive product and you just make it more expensive for, it's still just more expensive for the customer. We still really think you're going to have to bring down the prices for some of these products, or either through innovation, and manufacturing, or through some type of end customer subsidy. So, and probably a mix. So that's what we're seeing in the market. And I think, affordability and pricing is just still, is very sensitive in this market.
Yeah, thanks. That was really helpful. And I think, when PAYGO came out and it started to change the landscape a little bit, there wasn't as much discussion about how capital intensive it is, how complex it is. And so I think this is really important insight into this, right? Like, it is a great solution, but only for the right companies, and not for everybody. And I think that some would hope it would be for, just change, all the entire landscape for all companies. So that's really helpful. Another thing that you touched on, and I have been really thinking about this as we move to these modern energy cooking, appliances and technologies, is the cost that you brought up. It's really cost prohibitive for consumers, and you talked about in customer subsidies and other things to bring down that cost. I'd love to hear from yourself. You touched on it a little bit. Anybody else on the panel as well, because I think this is one where we're doing so much to ensure that the companies are moving forward and getting to scale. And then we look at the bottom of the pyramid, we look at the challenge with the ability to pay, and what are the solutions that we see for getting these really nice modern products into the lower income households. So you talked about in customer subsidies. Is there anything else in the space that we've seen that is helping to bring them into the market? Kate, you, or I open it up to anybody else on the panel here too. Ed, anybody, MECS, you guys have done a lot of research on this as well. So we'd love to hear just, I think this discussion is important as we talk about, really getting those folks who have electricity or in this space. What can we do to make it so it's not so cost prohibitive?
Donee, oh, sorry, Ed, you go, mate.
No, go on, you go for it, Ben.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just going to make a general comment. I think there's a few ways around addressing this. I think ultimately what we're seeing is a gap between the quality of the product we want to be putting into the market versus the overall cost of that product. And there's multiple ways I think we can go about solving that. And I think it's really just a question of what's the best combination to do that at scale. I think PAYGO presents a good solution, particularly in the early days. However, I think if carbon credits live up to its potential for moving forward and we actually execute on this opportunity correctly, it would get to a point, I think, where actually we don't need PAYGO because the amount of revenue coming through from carbon credits would mean that the pricing through to the customer would be quite marginal through to the customer, even with something like ATEC's e-cook stove, which is kind of a more higher end technology solution as well. So I think that's a good one. I think potentially once we're hitting that point, potential risk is we might actually go too far and end up in a point where we maybe actually be tempted, and we've seen this already in some markets in Asia, of just giving away the technology because of the carbon credit revenue. And I think that's it's going to be a temptation for the sector, and I think a risk that we don't go down that path because we've just seen very poor uptake of technology when that happens. I think that happened even with a high quality solution. So again, the usage verification through data, etc., will help to alleviate that problem moving forward. But yeah, I think we're in a very promising situation now if we can capitalize on these opportunities. I think PAYGO short term, ultimately carbon credits in the mid to long term will really overcome the price issue.
Yeah, do you want to add to that?
I guess that the only thing I was going to add is that, so two things maybe. One is that, yes, it's right to focus on the hardest to reach sectors, but in some ways, particularly with the newly emerging areas, focusing on getting that into the marketplace quickly in order to drive down prices through the scaling is an important component of it. I think secondly is that there are a considerable number of people in all urban areas that are still using fuels that are not good for them. And I think because of that, because of the urbanization process that's occurring across Africa, for example, is that over the next 20 years, that issue is going to get even stronger. And that then means that the proportion of the poor and those without access to clean cooking that are A, living in urban areas or semi-urban areas, and B, paying for their fuel because of the decreasing availability of alternatives, and certainly the lack of any access to free biomass in those contexts is going to accelerate. At the same time as the costs of alternatives come down, particularly as they are proven, like for example in the graph that we showed in the chat, there are some highly efficient appliances which are able to bring the price down to such a level where it is able to outcompete even charcoal, for example, in some of those areas. So I think all of that is really important. The other thing is when we talk about the need for finance, and one thing that Malcolm touched on that we haven't really talked about in this part is not only are we looking at the separate financing available for appliances and for driving down the costs of fuels to the customer and supporting relatively small organizations that are seeking to get their products into the market, we're also looking at the levels of financing going into that. So for example, there's been a lot made this year of significant investments into a number of LPG companies, for example. However, even with that, the amount going into the clean cooking sector is something like just over $1 billion, maybe this year, if you look at the SE for all figures. The amount going into the electricity infrastructure is 100 billion a year.
Yeah.
And even if just a small amount of that we're able to be devoted to, for example, ensuring that the electricity system is able to take an increased use of electric devices on it, then suddenly you're not actually looking at a significant expansion in financing. You're actually looking at how existing finance is utilized and drawing on that financing. So it's something that's already there, and it's making sure that it's then taken advantage of and used in that way. And most of what we've talked about in this report is about the financing of the companies and the financing of the devices themselves. However, there is this third other component, because if we're looking at the overall cost of bringing clean cooking, then you need to be looking at not only electricity infrastructure and so on, which is already there, but also the cost of developing, for example, a new LPG infrastructure where that LPG infrastructure maybe doesn't exist now. So if you're looking at all of those things in consort, the area with the largest potential of where that financing already exists is actually in the electricity infrastructure.
Yeah. That's all very helpful. And it's really, I mean, it's complex, but I think Ben also, talked about it. We also don't want to be subsidizing so much that then people are not using, right? And so there is, I think that it's a very, how much do you rely on carbon credits so that you can bring down the cost so that people, see, start to have demand for these products without, ruining the market, right? And I think it's a very complex issue that the report is starting to touch on, but we'll need to just be, I think, going forward, we're gonna need to be continually learning with the current companies that are out there, the enterprises that are actually going to scale, and what's happening on the infrastructure side within different countries who are, with their policies and programs like Uganda that now has that you actually shared with me, their cooking tariff, for example, and supporting that scale up of cooking through the policies as well. So it's all very helpful. I don't know, Peter, it looks like you would like to say something as well.
Yeah, it was in response to your earlier question, Donee, which was how do you reduce the costs for customers? One of the things that Mercy Corps does, and also E4I, is doing a lot of work in cash transfer payments. We've done some work with kind of the poorest communities in Kenya, working alongside government cash transfer schemes. giving them money so that they can
Mm-hmm.
use pay-as-you-go for solar home systems. In the same way, the same model can be used for clean cooking, and it's maybe something that we should give some more attention to.
It's actually a really good point, and not something we talk about a lot. It's obviously worked in a lot of other cases around the world, conditional or unconditional cash transfers. And actually, really briefly, we used it in Nepal for the disuse of dirty fuels. So not for adding on more technologies, but for the disuse. And we saw a huge uptake for the poorest, the lowest socioeconomic status when we started to frame it that way. So yeah, I think that's another good another thing to think about. We have only about 15 minutes, and I would love to get to Tim and Ash and Irene one more time, and then hopefully we have a minute or two for questions at the end. But you know, Tim, we've been talking a lot about this, and one of the things that we haven't brought up really is the Article 6 discussions. And how does this, sorry to give the hard questions to you, how does this, you know, how do we deal with this? And how can companies plan on the voluntary markets? And you know, what is, you know, the compliance regimes are going to be changing. A lot is happening under that. So it'd be good to hear, you know, how do we prepare ourselves for that? And what steps can we take to be in a good place once everything kind of settles?
Yeah, if I knew the answer to that.
Yeah,
No,
you'd be
no.
very wealthy, I think.
No, actually, I stuck my hand up to actually acknowledge that context and wondered whether or not we wanted to open up the nationally determined contribution Article 6 backdrop within the context of this webinar. But look, it's a really, really interesting question. And I think on the positive side of things, all of the questions that we're talking about, kind of proper pricing to encourage a kind of long-term sustainable commercial market to develop, making sure that the interventions or the businesses or the cook stoves are aligned with national prerogatives as well. I mean, this is exactly what the Paris Agreement, the nationally determined contribution 5-year cycle and Article 6 are structured in a way, if implemented correctly, to exactly feed into that context. So kind of slightly anecdotally, but under the clean development mechanism, there was kind of real challenges around securing letters of approval from certain countries. And some of the backdrop to that, though not always publicly available, was, yeah, there were some concerns around the level of ambition around the stoves being distributed, and maybe more interesting interest at the country level, at the national level, of utilising LPG resources that the country had and tapping into that rather than efficiently using charcoal. The CDM didn't lend itself to a political approach or a policy approach. I mean, some countries did it, but a lot of countries in the African context didn't manage to tackle it strategically. And I think, yeah, I mean, I'm not answering your question very well, but within the context of nationally determined contributions and Article 6, if countries get it right and give the correct signal and make sure that their ambition is met through that, then there's a real opportunity, I think, with the likes of the funding that Ash and others are also talking about, to unlock specific funding for specific interventions in certain areas of countries. I think I'll pause there because it's a bit of a politician's response. And there is another example where it might not go like that. But I think if countries get it right, then it has the ability to unlock and give a long-term signal to both public sector and private sector finance. Yeah.
Yeah, and here's where I think the transparency and the monitoring and verification and the digital technologies are so important, because we need to get it right. And so that, I think, is going to be very instrumental in this as well. And I think, yeah, like moving on to Ash, and when we talk about monitoring and verification, you know, obviously you're not operating under Article 6, but, you know, are these new digital technologies, will you be using them? Or is it something that's optional? And do you see any limitations to this approach with using the new digital technologies for, you know, the Internet of Things and so on and so forth?
Great, great. No, thank you for the question. And I'm always happy to talk about carbon finance. We've been working with this for so long, and it's great to see so much airtime, because I think that I wholeheartedly agree with all of the above, and I think the comments that Ben made were really quite instructive, because what we need is to make this easier. We saw with the CDM that you know, I think he described it as clunky. You know, you would get this, you would have this payment like 18 months after you were generating credits and whatnot, and you had all these barriers of financing barriers and so forth. And I think we need to make that easier. And I think digitization, the world has moved on, you know, from the first carbon projects I worked on in East Africa in 2000 and 2001. You know, I think we have to move with the times, and I think that the monitoring processes and methodologies, they've moved on, and I think the tech has moved on as well. So I guess that the issues really are around how that tech can be deployed. How, you know, it seems, of course, you know, if you're looking at some of the numbers that were mentioned by Peter, you know, you could be in the over subsidization game. You know, you could end up with you know, you could even say a misuse of public money. So what we're looking at really is, in some cases, advancing funds to, and this is public money, right? So we want companies to avail themselves of these opportunities, to use this to buy down the prices to reach the base pyramid consumers. But we recognize that actually there are barriers, and we want to try and address those. I think the use of digital payment solutions and stove use monitoring, other smart data features that have a more accurate tracking of fuel consumption, et cetera, the time is now, and we would like to support that. And our instrument is very much testing this approach, because it may not work. It may not work for all different types of projects. And you know, if you look, we tried to get some data on what the costs could be and so forth, and such a wide variation of what this would be on a per unit basis. I think it's well known in the LPG sector, less well known in some of the biofuel sectors, and we'd like to support companies both with grant funding, maybe to cover incremental costs of that sort of monitoring, but also with technical assistance as well.
Yeah, I think that's right too. I think the cost is still a big unknown. And also I still think there's room to bring that cost down, right? And so over time, I think we'll see a reduction in that cost. But yeah, it is, especially with some of those technologies that don't have the devices already included. Yeah, it might be a little bit cost prohibitive. And so that's something to be working on. But it's good to hear that that's where you're moving, because I think that's where we need to move in this space in general. We have, I think, time for one more question, then I'll go through the chats or the chats to see if there's any questions that come up for any of the panelists. So really quickly, if anybody has a question for any of the panelists, put those in the chat right now. But I would like to end it with Irene for my set of questions. So Irene, KPLC has attracted a lot of interest in its Peak Enough Power program. So we are moving a little bit away from what we've been discussing, but I think it's a really interesting program because you're featuring celebrity chefs and cooking demonstrations. You know, it's a little bit like Kenya's answer to Jamie Oliver. So do you see this as an opportunity for utilities to use their resources to promote the transition to clean cooking, both, you know, for behavior change, but also through financial incentives? Or do you think that this is kind of unique, you know, to KPLC? It would be good to hear what, you know, lessons learned you've had from this, and whether you've seen, you know, uptake because of this, and worth, you know, kind of worth the inversion of investment there.
Thank you. I see it as an opportunity for utilities to actually reach out to their customers and educate them and inform them of what is out there. A lot of our customers do not know what is out there, what behavior they can change, on what other equipment, appliances that they can use. And so we see it as a platform for us to educate our customers, because we have a very big base And most utilities have a very big base of customers, and these are people who visit you very often, who come to you very often on other queries. So they come to us often on other queries, they trust us, they see us as experts in this area. And so it's an opportunity for us to educate them on clean energy and clean use, and what other appliances are out there. And we're finding it surprising just how uninformed our people are, including our own staff. You talk about the EPC and what it does, and a lot of people do not know what it does, or how it works, or how little energy it uses. So it's an opportunity for Kenya Power and for other utility companies to educate their masses and their customers on how to use the electricity and how to sell. So through this, we're experiencing more and more people buying energy efficient equipment, and actually through this, then you get people who are happier to pay their bill, and as happy they are, the more happy they are, the more they use. And for us, it's an opportunity to sell and to grow our sales.
Thank you. That's encouraging to hear. We have just a couple of minutes, and I do want to wrap it up on time. There was one question on here that I thought, just to provide Tom from the audience, who's working with Article 6. So, UNFCCC is leading this, but you'll see lots of agencies that are playing a role. Gold Standard and the Swedish Energy Agency just came out with some discussion on it, and I know that they've been really working on it. Actually, the Clean Cooking Alliance is working with UNFCCC on a monitoring and verification document and guidance for clean cooking for this, because we do want that transparency. We want to make sure that that there's some kind of guidelines around that. So I think there's a lot of folks and organizations working on it, but obviously being led by the UNFCCC. Yeah, I don't think there's any other questions that we can answer in the last minute, but I want to thank all of the panelists for such a rich discussion today. I definitely learned a lot, and I really appreciate everybody's time that you took, and also Ed and team for putting together such a great report. I think this is really important for our time. Like I said earlier today, financing is going to be it's going to be needed in order for us to get to 2030. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a good morning, afternoon, and for those of you in Australia, Ben and others, please go to bed now. Thank you for joining, and yeah, have a great day.